Screen control, please, Maya.
It might take a little while, Grace. I'd just say you can start, and Maya can click through them in the meantime if you want, but otherwise you should be good to go.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our the first of our soil improvement webinars. Today we're focusing on cover crops and organic amendments. My name is Grace Choto, and I work for AHDB Horticulture as the Knowledge Exchange Manager for vegetables. Housekeeping, attendees are muted so we don't pick up any background noise. If you've got any questions, please don't keep them to yourself. I'll show you where to type them as we go. And then this webinar is timed. We should be finished by 3:15 or thereabouts. We're recording it. And for basis and Rosso points, you'll need to contact Maya, whose details, she's a colleague whose details I'll show you in the next slide. If you're tweeting, you need to tweet at AHDB Hort. Maya, you've gone too fast. Could you go back, please? Sorry about this. Again. Next slide. So to type in your questions, apologies for that. To type in your questions, you have a band on your screen on the right-hand side of your screen. And in this band, you can either minimize it or maximize it. Type in your questions. If you scroll down to the bottom of that bar, there's the bit which says question. Type your questions in as we go. We'll answer questions at the end of each presentation. For your basis points, contact maya.cultivation@ahdb.org.uk and we'll make available this recording for others. Soils, we've got within AHDB our own brand on soils work. It's called Great Soils, but as you know, soils are big across the globe. So the EU also has a project on soils that we're involved in, which is called EU Best for Soils. And both our research and KE program, as well as the Best for Soils, have resources available to you on websites, which I'll show you in the next slides. So for Great Soils, it's really extensive. We've done work for a number of years on soils. If you Google AHDB Great Soils, you'll find this website, and on it you have a lot of soil publications, including videos and fact sheets, as well as past project reports. So there's a lot on there. If you don't know about it, please have a look. At present, we've got two big partnership programs of work. They are 5-year programs of work. The first one is called Soil Biology, Soil Health Partnership, and it's being funded by AHDB and BBRO. As you know, a lot is known about soil physics and soil chemistry, but little, we're just beginning to understand soil health, yet it's integral in how soil functions because soil is a system. And this project has a lot of interlinked projects which are aiming to improve soil health and how to manage soils in favor of beneficial soil biology, as well as to develop and validate indicators of soil biology and soil health in research and on-farm trials. Project 4 and Project 7 in particular are looking at the effect of organic amendments on soil properties, either on long-term experimental trials or on Project 7 will be on horticultural crops. And then in Project 9, we've got a network of farmers and growers who are monitoring soil health in their own fields where different management approaches have been used. The second partnership program, again, this is 5-year with so many projects sitting within it, and it's the Rotations Partnership Program, and it's geared really on how to make rotations more agronomically and economically efficient. And these are rotations with potatoes within them. And it's got 4 work packages with different projects within it. And one of these, the yellow one, is looking at the impact of cover crops and organic amendments on crop yield and quality and on soil properties in researcher-led trials and then in farmer-led trials as well. So there's loads going on. And should you wish to find out more about these two programs, then go on the Great Soils website and you can Google, you can have a read on things that are already available. And a lot of the resources as well that are linked to this webinar or very specific or linked to the webinar. Two of the fact sheets I've put here, one on compost is good news for soil health, and the other one on soil pH were written by Audrey Litterick, who's one of our presenters today. So there's lots on there, have a look, but we've also got case studies from the Soil Biology Partnership Program. Now moving on to the European project, this is an EU Horizon 2020 Best for Soil project, which is led by 8 project partners who are applied researchers and advisors. For the UK, AHDB has a facilitation role, which ends on 30 September 2021. The project aims to improve soil health across Europe through the promotion of 4 best practices, and that's where the 4 is coming from here. And sound crop rotations. Again, it's got free access databases, fact sheets, and videos in 22 official languages to help practitioners improve soil health. And the 4 best practices they are looking at are compost, organic amendments, biosolarization where it works, cover crops, green manures, anaerobic soil disinfestation, and the databases on pathogens and nematodes to aid with crop rotational planning. Again, if you go on the Best for Soil website, if you Google EU Best for Soil, you'll go to the website, and on it, you've got a lot of resources. I've put a couple on there for you to see, particularly related to this topic, as well as videos. So moving on to our program today, we have 2 presentations from AHDB funded work. The first one will be from Anne Bogle of ADAS, and it covers, it's on cover crops, species selection and management. And these are findings from an AHDB Maxi cover crop project. Anne will be followed by Mark, and Mark will be speaking on quantifying the impact of cover crops and organic amendments. Following Mark, we'll have Audrey Litterick of Ethica Technical, who will speak on organic amendments, types, advantages, and disadvantages. So our first speaker, there's Anne. Anne is the principal soil scientist at ADAS. She's involved in research and development of policies on soil and nutrient management, and has interest in the impact of organic amendments and cover cropping on soil quality, carbon storage, and nutrient cycling. Anne led the AHDB Maxi cover crop project. She's FACTS qualified and a fellow of the British Society of Soil Scientists. Following Anne, we'll have Mark Allison, and Mark leads the AHDB's Rotations Partnership Program, which I talked about. He holds a BSc in Agric Chemistry and a PhD on the effects of straw incorporation on soil biological processes. Mark worked at Broom's Experimental Station before work as an agronomist and crop nutritionist, and he now works on crop modeling, nutrition, and agronomy. And our last speaker will be Audrey Litterick, who's the director of Ethica Technical Limited. I can vouch that Audrey is the practical crop and soil scientist, because Anne was a contractor on the original AHDB Great Soils project, from which the Great Soils banner derives its name. Her key interests lie in the practical measurement of soil health and the development of methods to maintain and improve it. And she works with soil practitioners to assess and manage soil health to ensure for the safe and effective use of organic amendments on farmland and in the restoration of derelict and degraded land. So without further ado, can I hand over to our first speaker, Anne Bogle of ADAS.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Grace, for asking me to come and speak today at this webinar. And I'm going to be covering some of the results from the AHDB Maxi Cover Crop project. So can I have my first slide and mouse control, if possible, up, please? Nothing happening. Great, that's lovely. Thank you very much. Right, let's turn that off. Okay, so yes, the findings of the Maxi cover crop project. Well, first of all, I thought we'd just talk about why we want to do cover cropping. And there are a number of benefits of having cover crops in the rotation, and perhaps the original one why cover crops have been introduced is just purely by name. They provide overwinter cover, thereby reducing erosion, runoff and nitrate leaching, thereby retaining nitrogen and phosphorus and improving soil fertility. But also more recently, we've been recognising the potential benefits of cover crops for soil structure, water holding capacity and porosity through their roots and through the return of fresh organic matter. They can be used as weed management tools to disrupt pest and weed disease cycles, and they can provide increased biodiversity and habitats. So they are an option within countryside stewardship. And then finally, you can actually use them for a financial return in terms of grazing sheep and using them as a forage crop. So I just wanted to go into some of the benefits actually of the evidence for those benefits. And here's a slide of some work we've been doing with Anglian Water in recent years. And this particular study, we looked at different cover crop treatments and their impact on nitrate leaching. So we had a treatment that was just uncultivated stubble, and the losses of nitrate were the highest where we did this. But if we just did a little bit of cultivation and stimulated some weed growth, we got about 35% cover, and that had a significant impact on nitrate leaching. But obviously where we actually drilled a cover crop, and particularly a cover crop with radish, and this premium mix which had 10 different species in it, including brassicas, phacelia and legumes, we saw where we had about 80–90% cover, we saw a significant drop off in nitrate leaching, so less than 10 kilograms of nitrogen lost on those treatments. And so this obviously is not only good for water quality, but also provides nutrients for the crop going forward, so it holds on to those nutrients. And so then here, another piece of work we did with this time Portsmouth Water on their shallow chalky soils in Hampshire. This is working with a farmer in his farmer's field, so having tram lines of different treatments. And he grew an oat cover crop, just farm saved oats. Unfortunately, it didn't establish particularly well, so he only got 30% cover, so that actually the highest nitrate leaching losses were on that treatment. On his stubble, which had a good cover of weeds and volunteers, nitrate leaching losses were lower. But where we had a phacelia, and this was a phacelia mixed with oats, so you can see the benefit of just having that extra species in the mix, we got 90% cover and less than 10 kilos lost. And this obviously had an impact on the amount of nitrogen left in the soil in the spring when he went to establish his spring barley. So it pushed the index up, and we were therefore able to reduce the amount of nitrogen that we applied to the spring barley, and that had no impact on the subsequent grain yields. And it's not only nitrate that can be improved. We can also see a reduction in erosion and sediment losses. So this is some work we did for DEFRA, looking at oversowing maize with different cover crops that were then taken on into the winter after the maize had been harvested. So the conventional had no cover, we had a ryegrass cover, and we had a biodiverse mix, which again didn't establish particularly well. So where we had that good cover, 80% cover ryegrass, we saw that sediment losses were significantly reduced. So it's not only, as I say, water quality issues, it's soil structure and soil health where we see benefits. So again, this is working with farmers in the Maxi cover crop project at the Kent Monitor Farm. And here the farmer had two different cover crops, a simple mix of just oats and clover, and then a more complex mix of 5 different species. And this first chart just shows the penetration resistance with depth. So the blue line is where we had no cover, and the red and the yellow where we had cover. And you can see that there's an improvement in the resistance, so the ease with which an implement will penetrate the soil, roots will penetrate the soil where we had a cover crop present. Moreover, we saw an improvement in soil biology. So we counted earthworms actually in the winter crop. So we grew the cover crop, then you had a spring crop, then in the winter crop we counted earthworms. And so a year after the cover crop had been in place, and we saw a significant increase in earthworm numbers, with actually the increasing diversity of the mix that we grew. So where we had that 5 species mix, we had more earthworms. So clear benefits to not only water quality, but to soil health. But obviously, once you decide you want to go into cover cropping, there's a lot of questions that you need to consider, particularly around what species you might want to grow. Do you want to grow straight, or do you need to mix it up, and how many species should you have in that mix? And here it really depends on what you want to achieve, what fits with your rotation, and how much it's going to cost, how much you're prepared to pay. Then once you've decided that, you need to think about how it's going to be established and managed going forward, and then destroyed. So what impact that might have on the subsequent seed beds of your subsequent crop. And it really is a case of no one size fits all. It's a case of actually testing what might work best for your cropping system and modifying it going forward. So adapting according to what you achieve in one particular year. But there are some pointers that we can do, and this was where Maxi Cover Crop came in to try and answer some of these questions. It was a cereals and oilseeds project, and the aim was to look at the effect of different cover crops on soil properties, crop rooting and yield. And although it was with cereals and oilseeds, the messages hold for all crop types really. So we did this in a series of experimental plot experiments, but also we wanted to validate what we saw in these experimental plots in the large scale with monitor farmers, so looking at tram lines of different treatments to see if they work in practice. So when it comes to cover crop species, there's obviously a lot of potential choice out there. You can broadly divide these into legumes and non-legumes as to whether they fix nitrogen from the atmosphere or whether they're taking it up from the soil. And the non-legumes, we would divide into brassicas, grasses, and then some other species. And so there's various versions of these tables out there in guidance documents. Brassicas, such as mustards and radishes, these are particularly good at rooting. They have potential for biofumigation, so nematode control, and they're very good at nutrient uptake. But if you've got brassicas in your rotation, then you could, particularly oilseed rape, you might have problems with rotational conflicts and disease. Obviously, cereals, oats, rye, ryegrass, again, these establish rapidly, they provide good cover and can be deep rooting. But again, need to think about using them in rotations with other cereals. Legumes such as vetch, clovers and peas, these need to be established a little bit earlier than some of those other species, particularly if you want to get a decent amount of nitrogen fixation to occur, as fixation tends to slow and stop when temperatures drop below about 5 degrees C. And then you also need to think about using them in rotations with peas and beans. And then the beauty of these other species, like Phacelia, buckwheat, for example, they don't have those rotational conflicts. Phacelia in particular has a good root system and is good for nutrient uptake, but a number of these are not entirely frost tolerant, which might be helpful actually in terms of when it comes to destruction. Obviously, if you're going to graze the cover crop, then you need to think of some other things. How much dry matter will it produce? What's the quality in terms of nutrition? And is it palatable? Are your sheep going to like it? So in Maxi Cover Crop, we tried to pick a selection of those different categories of treatment. So we had a brassica in the form of oil radish, a couple of cereals, a couple of legumes, and then 2 of that other category, so buckwheat and phacelia. And then we mixed those up in various mixes of complexity, increasing complexity. So we had a very simple mix of oats and clover, then we had a 3-way mix and a 5-way mix. And these mixes are what the farmers tested and tried out in their fields. The single species were used in the plot experiments. So when it comes to looking at cover crop performance, we had our plot experiments at 3 sites, and we found that drilling date and soil moisture, soil texture had a key impact on how well that cover crop performed. So when we established the cover crops in mid-September on a light sandy soil, we only got about 1 tonne of dry matter and took up about 25 kilos of nitrogen. When we managed to get in a month earlier on slightly heavier textured soils, the performance was much better, so up to 3.5 tonnes of dry matter and 70 to 90 kilos of nitrogen uptake. And so this chart just shows an average across those 3 sites of the nitrogen uptake. And so you can see there was evidence of a bit of nitrogen fixation going on with the vetch and the clover. Oil radish was good at scavenging nitrogen, and the mixes containing oil radish and phacelia also particularly good at nitrogen uptake. But what we weren't able to establish was when the nitrogen was released and available for the subsequent crop in the rotation. Another key aspect of Maxi cover crop was to look at cover crop rooting. This hasn't been studied much, and so we felt it important, particularly from the impact on soil structure, to look at crop rooting. So this is the root length density, so the amount of root in centimetres per centimetre cubed of soil, going down through the profile of those different single species that we had in Maxi cover crop. And you can see here that the radish and the rye were particularly good, sorry, the phacelia and the rye were particularly good at rooting in the topsoil, so it had the highest amount of root, followed by the radish, and then things like the clover and the vetch. With the control and the buckwheat, so the control was a weedy control, and the buckwheat having a much lower rooting capacity, with the buckwheat actually frosting off at the very first frost, so we lost it in November each year. What we also measured was rooting in the subsequent spring barley crop to see if there was a relationship between the amount of rooting that we got in the cover crop with the amount of rooting that we got in the spring barley. And unfortunately, in just a single year, we weren't able to establish that relationship. As I say, you do need to consider rotational conflicts, and this was clearly evident in Maxi cover crop, where we had spring barley following our cover crop treatments. So where we had spring oats and rye as a single straight cover crop, we saw a decline in yield. But interestingly, where we had spring oats in the mix, so mix 1 and mix 3 both had spring oats in it, we didn't see those yield impacts. So it looks like actually when you put it in a mix, that effect is not so great. So just to remind you that cereals in rotation, consider maybe avoiding having a straight oat or rye or cereal cover crop. Likewise with oilseed rape, mustards and radishes, and as I said, pulses and legumes. Vetch or clover as a single species might not be appropriate. And so just a comment on cover crop mixtures. Obviously, it helps manage risk. So if you remember from the Portsmouth water work, where we didn't get the oats establishing very well, where we mixed it up with phacelia, we managed to rectify and manage that risk by having the phacelia there to sort of take over. But also, having multiple species present can give multiple benefits. So there's evidence in the literature that where you might mix a cereal with a legume, that can enhance the amount of nitrogen that is fixed by the legume. Also, if you remember from the Maxi cover crop work at the monitor farm, we saw that where we increased the diversity of the mixture, we got more earthworms, so we improved the soil biology. But you do have to weigh that up against the additional cost of having a mixture and potentially more complicated management where you might have different seed sizes that you need to drill. As I say, timings are critical. These are just pictures of 2 of the cover crops in the Maxi cover crop trial, where on that sandy soil drilled in mid-September, oats didn't establish well compared to oats drilled mid-August on a slightly heavier textured soil. You can see visually big differences in their performance that then were measured also in terms of the above ground dry matter, amount of nitrogen that was taken up. So early establishment is key. But we also found that timings are critical when it comes to destruction as well, particularly on heavy soils and in wet seasons. So working with one of the monitor farmers up in Yorkshire, who was growing a spring bean crop after the different cover crop treatments. This is just a chart of the moisture content down through the profile. If you just look at the topsoil, the top 30 centimetres, you can see a significant increase in moisture content where we had a good crop, cover crop biomass, and we think that's just sort of acting as a sort of mulch on the soil surface. It was a wet spring and the farmer had to turn the site around very quickly, so he actually sprayed off and drilled his spring beans within a week. The spring beans obviously didn't like wet, cold topsoils, and this is a measure of his the root length a month after he drilled them. So we saw lower rooting, and that then led to a yield decline of up to almost half a tonne when he got to harvest. So leaving a reasonable gap between destruction and the establishing of your next crop is key in order to allow that soil to dry out. So just a couple of comments about cover crop destruction. Glyphosate is by far the most common method used, but there are alternatives, and obviously there are question marks over the use of glyphosate going forward. So we can flail, we can crimp, roll, disc or graze a cover crop. We don't know quite so much about what impact these have on the quality of the subsequent seedbed, the amount and timing of nitrogen release, the impact on weeds, pests and pathogens, and the dependence on weather conditions. So for example, crimping, rolling may require it to be done really on a frost so that you get a good crushing of the stems. So it is very dependent on weather conditions. There's a couple of field labs that innovative farmers are leading that have worked or are currently working on this. One that was carried out in 2019 on alternative methods saw no negative impact of crimping on rolling or chopping compared to glyphosate on the subsequent crop yield. And then there's a new field lab that we're working on this winter looking at grazing of cover crops. So in that field lab, we're looking at the nutritional quality of the cover crop mixes that we're growing and the impact of having the sheep on soil structure and on nitrogen release from the cover crop and how that impacts the subsequent yield of the following crop. So talking about crop impacts on yields, I would say that certainly in cereal rotations, we found in Maxi cover crop that, that we get a variable response. So these are just 3 farmers that we're working with, barley, beans and barley in Kent, Yorkshire and Huntington. In Kent, we saw a marginal increase in yield where we had the cover crops. In Yorkshire, with that bean cover crop, the bean cash crop, we saw a decline in yields. And in Huntington, we saw no change in yields. So it really is quite variable, but I would say this was just after 1 season of cover cropping, and really we need to look at it as a long-term investment needing repeated cycles of cover cropping, especially if you want to look at the soil health improvement aspects. So that's me almost done. Just to summarise, cover crops, I hope I've shown you are good at providing nitrogen uptake and have benefits to water quality and soil structure and health, but do need to consider carefully what species you choose, get them in as early as possible, and leave a good window between destruction and establishment of your next crop. But be prepared to mix it up a bit for variable impacts on yields, and actually do a little bit of trialling and testing and adapting as you go forward. So it does need to be a long-term commitment. So that's me done. Just a few acknowledgements for the farmers involved in Maxi cover crop and the large experimental plot sites, the hosts of those, and all the partners that were involved within the Maxi cover crop project. So without further ado, that's me done. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Anne. We do have a few questions for you. The first one is, are cover crops suitable for beneath apple pear trees? So cover crops, are they suitable beneath apple pear trees?
Yeah, I don't see why not at all, really. In some respects, they should be beneficial in terms of providing cover and nutrient release for tree fruit. Yes.
Yes. The next one is on earthworm numbers. Is it known just which food is most useful for earthworm proliferation? Are all decaying leaves equally useful? How often is earthworm growth limited by lack of food?
Yeah, that's quite a tricky one. So I didn't quite get where you're going. How is it? Often is it limited by food supply? Obviously, earthworms.
Yeah, like different cover crops. You know, are there some nice juicy ones for loads of earthworms, and something maybe we should avoid if we're looking at earthworm numbers?
I don't think there's anything particular that you should avoid. Earthworms, like certainly the deep burrowing earthworms, which are the nice ones for improving soil structure and drainage, they feed on surface trash. So actually having litter being returned to the soil is really beneficial, regardless of the type of litter. Just straw actually on the surface, earthworms seem to enjoy. So I don't think necessarily there's been the work on what an earthworm would choose. That's given different feed sources, but certainly it seems, certainly in the work that we did initially, earthworms numbers seem to like having diversity of different things to eat, but you know, who knows really.
Yes, and then in the Maxi cover crop trial, were the soils cultivated between the cover and cash crops? If so, what were the cultivations?
They were so we just used light cultivation, so they would have been obviously not ploughed, but not direct drilled, so they would have been it depended on the farmer. A lot of the farmers actually use strip tillage actually for establishing their cover crop and then establishing their cash crop. So it was very variable, but there was a light cultivation. So no more than sort of 10 centimetre depth maximum cultivation.
And we've got a number of questions. I'll ask two more and then maybe we can come back to them at the end of all the presentations if we still got time, but we'll probably ask you to answer them as well for our website. Okay. And given the wet end of August this year, does this mean it's not great for cover crop establishment? How do farmers cope with variability in weather?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. No, cover crops should be fine. It's just being able to get onto the soil. Obviously, I would suggest that if the soils are too wet, that you really shouldn't be tracking across them to try and get a cover crop in. So that is a tricky one. You want the cover crop there as soon as you can, if possible, but if it's too wet, then don't do it. Wait till it's perhaps easier to get on the land and get a cover crop in. It is tricky.
The last one we'll ask is there sufficient carbon uptake in cover crops that could be used to offset or sell carbon from?
That's a really good question, and I could spend ages trying to talk about it. Personally, I don't think there is, and it would be very difficult to quantify and verify that you have got sufficient carbon there to get payment for it. Having said that, there's no doubt that you're adding carbon and organic matter back into the soil, but it's quite small, and it would be hard to measure and verify, which you would need for a payment, really.
Thank you very much, and we might come back to you. There's quite a number of questions. We are moving on now, just in the interest of time, and our next speaker is Mark Allison of NIAB CUF, and Mark is speaking on quantifying the impact of cover crops and organic amendments. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. So this afternoon, I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so just talking about, as Grace mentioned, another AHDB project, which we're going to be looking at the effects of organic amendments and cover crops, mainly on performance potato crops, but we've also got a few root vegetable crops in there as well, which hopefully you find of interest. So if I get rid of that, and if I have mouse control. Okay, so just for a brief recap of the program. It's a 5-year program, AHDB funded, and as Grace mentioned, we're investigating the environmental and economic sustainability of rotations. As I mentioned earlier, main emphasis on potatoes, but also looking at root veg and cereals. And a feature of the program is, it's multi-agency, and we've listed the various people involved in the project at the bottom. So you've got Rothamsted, the James Hutton Institute, Lancaster University, BIOS, who are providing some statistical services. And the other sort of key component of this group are the growers that we get involved with. So we've got about 20 collaborating growers who willingly provide their land, their time, their efforts, their input into the project. And again, I'll just take this opportunity right at the start to thank them, because without this, it wouldn't be possible. And having all these people involved, in the growers, the agronomists, we can start to get what I've called crowdsourced data. So rather than us going out and doing 1 or 2 detailed experiments on 1 or 2 locations, we can actually get data from lots of locations, lots of different soil types, lots of different rotational types, and then combine them, analyze them, hopefully something useful will fall out of it. So if you just move on. So the first slide, this is actually from some survey data, and survey data is really useful. It's quite easy to do. You just ask growers what they've been up to. And what we did here is went to a group of growers and said, what's the yield of your potato crop? They reported that, and then we asked them, well, before that potato crop, did you or did you not grow a cover crop, or did you not use an organic amendment? They responded to that, and we've sent the data up to Catherine Preedy at BIOS, and she's done some statistics on it. And if we look at just the orange bars there, the effect of cover crop or no cover crop, you can see that from the survey data, there is a numeric benefit from growing a cover crop. So if you look at where the small black dot in the middle of the orange bars, that is the mean of all those data. And as you can see, when you use a cover crop, there is a numeric increase in yield, a reasonably large one. Similarly, we ask the same kind of questions for where we have an organic amendment. What was the yields? And then there is a numeric increase where we have an organic amendment before the potato crop, much smaller than the where we have a cover crop. So I think that is sort of quite interesting, quite useful, but you wouldn't want to use these kind of survey data to perhaps dictate what we should be doing nationally. And so what we did from then is say, well, can we do some field experiments? And the next slide just shows you the kind of things we did. So these are some experiments we did. This happens to be a mustard cover crop where we asked the grower to plant up this field, the mustard crop, as per normal. Just as a bit of background, we don't specify what kind of cover crop the grower should use. They just use what they would perhaps find available, what perhaps they can know what works for them in their particular circumstances. So in this particular circumstance, he's used a mustard cover crop. And what he has done is, you can see from the diagram, he's left an unplanted area 12 meters wide, 240 meters long, where there's no cover crop. And the inset, the picture above, it just shows you what it looks like standing in that strip. So essentially, you're looking at bare soil versus quite a vigorous cover crop. So anyway, the grower manages the cover crop. Eventually, it will be destroyed. And then the following spring, we plant a potato crop, let that grow as per normal, standard management across the field. And then in the autumn, we then take some samples from the two areas. So in this case, we take 4 digs from where we have a cover crop and match that with 4 digs when we have no cover crop. And then we measure the yield and sort of start to analyze the quality of that potato crop. So this is just an example of the data from that field. It's a variety called Tyson. And if you can look through those data, so we have 4 replicates, and you can see essentially there's very little effect on the number of plants per hectare, very little effect on the cover crop and the stems or the tuber populations. But where we have a cover crop, we've actually increased the yield by about sort of 2.8 tons per hectare. And also there's a small effect on the tuber dry matter content. Now, the point about this is, one strip trial doesn't really prove anything. Those differences in yield could quite easily have come about from just the location of strip in the field. It may have been slightly more fertile, maybe slightly better soil structure, and that is the reason why the cover crop area had a slightly better yield. But what we can do is actually combine that with lots of data, similar experiments done from lots of experiments around the country in different years. Before we go on to that, though, I just want to show you an example of where we've done this similar with an onion crop. These data are actually collected for us on our behalf by Vegetable Consultancy Services. And again, in this particular experiment, again, it's a strip trial where we have a control strip of where there's no cover crop. We have various mixes. And again, they've gone in at the end of the harvest of the onion crop and measured the number of bulbs per hectare, the yield per hectare. And in this particular instance, we're also interested in the effect of the cover crops and the incidence of fusarium in the onion crop. And again, just looking through these data, there's, generally speaking, the cover crops perform particularly well in relation to control. There's perhaps an indication that where we have a Phacelia and crimson clover, it hasn't performed quite as well. But again, we have the same caveat that that strip, whether that comparison was in, it may have been a poor area of soil. And it's only when we collect lots of data together that we can actually sort of tease out what's really happening with these different cover crops. So just going back to potatoes, and say the real power comes when you do lots of comparisons. And this shows the data up to 2019. We're still adding the 2020 data into this database. But what you can see is that we've got in the last 3-4 years of the program, we've got 67 different experiments, most of which are looking at the effect of different amendments and different cover crops. But we've also got some experiments looking at different cultivations or effects of different wheeling configurations. So if we now sort of turn our attention to perhaps looking at all the cover crop experiments we've done, which is the next slide. So this is a summary of the data we've collected to date. And just to explain what this graph is showing, so the white colored bars are the yields of the controls. So you can see The yields vary for that very first left-hand crop. It was about 42 tonnes per hectare, ranging up to one crop, about 8 crops down, where you're getting up nearly 80 tonnes per hectare. And then added on to that is the effect of the cover crop. Now, in some cases, and this links into what Anne was saying, the effect was negative. We actually seem to lose yield where we have a cover crop. But again, if you look at all the data put together, we can see that on average, you actually have more crops where there's a benefit of growing a cover crop. And if you look at the far right-hand bar, which is the mean of all the data we've collected to date, you actually see there's a small, about 3-tonne benefit from growing cover crops over all the sites we've tested so far. We can also do the similar for where we have amendments, and again, we haven't differentiated between the different types of amendments at this stage of analysis. So it could be things like FYM, or it could be green waste compost. We haven't made that differentiation yet, but that will come in subsequent analysis. So if we actually look at the data for the amendments, again, we've got a whole range of background yields with controls. And the red areas are the effects of the amendment on relative to control. So again, in some cases, we have a negative effect of the organic amendments. But again, like the cover crops, on the majority of those experiments, there's a benefit. And if you look right to the end, the mean of all those data, again, there's a benefit, about 2 tonnes in this case, from growing the cover crop, from using an amendment, excuse me. So if we then take all those data and perhaps do a few statistics on them. So in the 20 comparisons where we had used a cover crop, we had an increase in yield of about 2.9 tonnes. And when we do a paired t-test, the benefit was statistically significant, so at about the 2.4% level. Whereas with the organic amendments, we had 24 comparisons. The response was smaller, 1.9 tonnes a hectare. And at the moment, although numerically we have a benefit from using organic amendments, that at the moment is not significantly significant. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. So one of the things we're interested in is, what are cover crops doing to the soil? And perhaps Anne has touched on that in her talk. So one of the things we're interested in is, we bring all these cover crops, how much nitrogen, for example, are they releasing back to our potato crop, or our onion crop, or our parsnip crop? And one way of perhaps assessing that is to look at the C/N ratio of the cover crops. And as you can see from this chart, there's quite a range of C/N ratios. Most of them have a C/N ratio of about 15 to 20, but some are very high C/N ratios. Essentially, we're incorporating straw. Now, the point about that is that unless you have C/N ratios, perhaps less than 15, they're not going to release significant amounts of nitrogen back to your potato crop in this case. So the question still remains, what is a benefit? We are doing the analysis at the moment, but we think that in many cases, the use of the cover crop is actually is drying the soil out to a certain extent before planting. This means that we have better cultivations of our soils before we plant our potatoes, and that is where the benefit is coming from. And we've got a little bit of data later on that would perhaps support that conjecture. We've also been measuring things like soil moisture at planting in the cover crop and control areas, and again we can see some significant differences, and also factors such as bulk density. So if we move on. So one of the things we were interested in doing is perhaps look at the economics of using cover crops and also amendments. So if we look at the economics of cover crops to start off with, one of the things we asked our growers is, how do you actually establish your cover crop? How do you manage them? And then how do you destroy them? So the growers responding to this, they used to give us a list of the cultivations they used to establish their cover crop, anything they used to do to perhaps maintain their cover crops, and then the methods they used to destroy them. And what we did, we just used some standard industry figures to actually put a cost against each of those operations, and from that, estimate a cost of growing a cover crop compared with essentially not growing a cover crop. And the next chart shows you some of the results of that. So the growers responding also supplied us with the costs of seed. So it can actually be essentially free if you're using volunteer cereals and weeds as a cover crop. But it can actually get quite expensive depending on if you're using some of these quite expensive seed mixes that Anne talked about earlier. If we look at the total cost, the median cost, the 50 percentile on average, was the average cost was about £210 per hectare. So that includes the seed cost and all the cultivations used to establish your crop. Now, bear in mind that on average, we're getting about 3 extra tons of yield where we are growing a cover crop. It looks like these sort of economics sort of stack up. There does seem to be, if you spend on average £200, extra £200 to establish a cover crop, you should be able to get that back in extra yield. So again, this is very sort of preliminary analysis, but it does seem to support, the data do seem to support that cover crops, they support increased yields, maybe good for soil health, but they start to stack up in terms of the economics as well. Just spend a couple of slides looking at organic amendments. Now, one of the things we've looked at is perhaps just look at the annual effects of organic amendments. If you apply it before your potato crop, can you measure a benefit in the potato crop? It may be useful to also look at organic manures in a longer term basis, and these are just some data from a publication European coming out a couple of years ago, where they've looked at long-term experiments through several European countries and looked at the average response to organic amendments over and above what you could expect from just the straight nutritional value. So if you're adding organic amendments and it's improving soil structure, improving soil biology, how much is that worth in the extra yield? And if you just look at the crop type chart below, you can see that things like potatoes actually are one of the most responsive crops to organic manures. And that's what's felt because it's a spring sown crop, and the rooting systems of potatoes are particularly sensitive to soil conditions. And that may be why we actually see bigger responses to organic amendments in potatoes, as opposed to things like winter wheat crops or barley crops, for example. So if we look at within our current program, we've took on a couple of long-term experiments. This is just one example of which this is effects of farmyard manure at Broom's barn in Suffolk. And what we did here, we have a long-term history of organic amendments. In this case, we had the old FYM, was 60 tonnes a hectare of FYM applied once every 3 years since the mid-60s up to 2012. And then we compared that with a fresh application of FYM applied in October 2016. And you can see actually the historic FYM actually gives a bigger response in yield than the newer FYM. And again, we're trying to understand at the moment, is this due to just purely soil physical conditions, or is it a combination of soil physics and soil biology? So again, this is ongoing work, but again, I think it does show that perhaps just applying organic amendments immediately before your potato crop and expecting a big benefit may be a too simplistic way of looking at this. And we have got Andy Whitmore at Rothamsted trying to model these effects. So if you have got limited availability of organic amendments, what is the best way of using them? Is it best to concentrate on your poorest soils, possibly your best soils even, and do you go on with large applications, one or two fields, or small application over lots of fields? So linked in with that is, I've just got some data here, and this is just dealing with green waste composts, where we've measured in 11 samples that growers applied to their fields. we looked at the nutrient content of those organic amendments and then tried to work out how much those nutrients are worth. And we also looked at, or got one of the growers to actually calculate how much it costs him to apply green waste composts. Now, the nutrient values in terms of the PK, magnesium, sulfate, possibly the trace elements, probably is about 180, 190 pounds value to the next crop. Once you've taken into account the cost of buying your green waste compost, casting it and spreading it, that's probably costing you about 230 pounds. So the nutrition value is not really covering the application cost. And I guess the key thing is how much is that carbon worth to the rotation, to the yields. And again, we're still modeling this. Andy Whitmore's is looking at the data currently, really to actually say, if you are using green waste compost, their cost is going up because more and more people are using them. It's a case of supply and demand. Do they make sense, and what is the best way of using these products? One of the additional benefits of using a cover crop, this is illustrated in this chart, and these are some data from one of the Spot farms run by AHDB. And what we're looking at here is the effects of having a cover crop or no cover crop on the amount of diesel you use cultivating the fields before you establish your potato crop. So these data are actually collected by Anne Stone, who works for AHDB. She sat in the tractor cab and taking spot measurements as the tractor and implements move through the areas with cover crop or no cover crop. And hopefully you can see that essentially the work rate of these different operations wasn't affected by having a cover crop. But there is a significant change in the amount of diesel you use working the soil. So where we have a cover crop, due to improved soil structure, the diesel consumption is about 3/4 of what it is in control. And this is an additional benefit. Now, not only you're getting an increase in yield about 3 tons a hectare, it does seem to also reduce the amount of diesel you need to spend working your soils. Now, we haven't got much of this kind of data, so we can't say this with absolute confidence, but anecdotally, other growers would actually tend to support this as well. So are cover crops all good? Well, I think, again, sort of linking in with what Anne said in her talk, we actually need to be aware that we are adding sort of biological material into our soils, and in some cases, that may have a negative impact on our potato crop in this case, but it could be other crops. And one of the things we need to be aware of is that some cover crop species are alternative hosts for plant parasitic nematodes, and if you're not careful in your species collection, selection, you could actually increase the incidence of potential pests and also potential diseases. So again, it's just we need to bear this in mind when we're designing our rotations, that we have thought about not only the benefits of using cover crops, but perhaps some of the downsides as well. As an aside, just this year we had a grower, part of the program. He was growing oilseed radish, oil radish as a cover crop. He's actually growing potato for salad, which is small potatoes, and he had problems due to destoning, actually separating out the radish roots that's coming across in the destoner. So again, there are things you need to think about as we're designing our rotations. So just to finish off, I think economically we can make a case for using cover crops, especially with perhaps all the additional benefits, perhaps of increased work rates with our due to reduced diesel consumption. The benefits of organic amendments are perhaps smaller, but we're working on that, but there may be sort of longer term benefits with repeated applications of organic manures. And again, we need to quantify that better, so we actually end up with a better strategy for using these materials. So I think they are, as people use them more often, they're going to be more shorter supply. We need to consider the possible downsides of using cover crops, and indeed organic materials as well in the rotations. This particular project was concentrating mainly on soil physical properties, and there are small benefits in soil physical properties due to cover crops and organic amendments. They're particularly things like perhaps soil drying prior to cultivations, and also reductions in bulk density and improved porosity. But there are probably undoubtedly other things going on as well. And again, we need to be quantifying these a little bit better as well. So that's me done. Thank you very much, and be happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Mark. We've got a couple of questions. I will ask just 3 of them, I think, because we need to move on. Yep. The first one, you mentioned that cover crops with higher carbon-nitrogen ratio won't release very much nitrogen to the following crop. Will this nitrogen be more readily available to the future crop or to future crops?
Yes, I mean, I think our understanding of sort of carbon-nitrogen dynamics, it was you build up, this will essentially be building up soil organic matter, and that will eventually sort of be available in small quantities later in later rotation or later rotations. It will be small amounts, so there may be benefits to soil structure just by having that extra carbon in the soil, but the effects of nutrition are probably going to be fairly small.
Thank you. The second one, is there a relationship between cover crop carbon-nitrogen ratio and the potato yield? Kind of related?
Not that we've noticed. So as that chart showed, we've grown a huge range of, well, not only biomass, but also carbon-nitrogen ratios. What we think the main effect of the cover crops is basically a little bit on soil drying, which helps with cultivation, and also, as I mentioned in my conclusions, there's an effect on soil bulk density and porosity. That is not really to do with any effect on carbon-nitrogen ratio.
And the last one, under drought conditions, when irrigation equipment is stretched, could a cover crop or an applied amendment provide the grower with a useful increase in soil moisture holding, perhaps?
My colleague Mark Sullins looked at this. Improvements in soil structure will help a little bit and rooting, so you actually increase the volume of soil your crop can exploit. It can help a bit in water availability, but in the grand scheme of things, it may only delay, perhaps you'll need to irrigate by a day or so. So if you need to irrigate, you're going to need to irrigate. In unirrigated systems, there may be a little bit more water in the system that may help. But in a practical sense, it's not going to have a huge effect.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll move on now to Audrey Litterick of FK Technical, and Audrey speaking on organic amendments, types, advantages, disadvantages.
Thanks very much, Grace. If you could give me control of the slides. Now we're running about 10 minutes late. Do you want me to do something about that? Do you want me to try cut my presentation, or would you just want me to go through as it stands?
I think go through it as it stands. If we are struggling for questions, then we could always answer them later, just in case some delegates need to go. So we'll just go for it. Okay.
Now I still haven't got control of the slides yet, so I'll just try and start and hope that it appears as we go on. So I'm going to be speaking about organic amendments, different types, and the advantages and disadvantages of each. Now, just to summarise that, Maya, if you could shift the slides on, because I'm not getting any control just now at all. Nothing's come up. Oh, that's it coming on now. So to summarise, first of all, I'll define what I'm talking about, and we'll look at types of organic amendments from the farm, on farm or off farm, and look at the advantages and disadvantages of each of those. Next slide, please. Now we can talk about organic amendments, and what I'm talking about is bulky organic amendments, the kinds which are applied in large quantities, so tons per hectare, rather than materials bought in wee boxes or bags, for example, such as seaweed extracts and biohumates and fulvic acid. These are applied in tiny quantities, perhaps kilograms per hectare. So we'll look at the main types of farm-derived materials, solid manures, farmyard manures, things like cattle and sheep manures, and look at the differences briefly between them and liquid manures, so mainly cattle and pig manure slurries, for example. Poultry manures, which are a case apart really. I'll say a little bit about crop and green manure residues. Both Anne and Mark have mentioned these already, and I have to say I found those presentations very interesting, and their opinions are very close to some of mine. And then I'm also going to raise a kind of new subject, talk a bit about wood chip and as a soil amendment and wood chip based composts. There's a lot of interest in these just now. And then for those arable farms who have no animals of their own and no trees to make any wood chip, some of the off-farm inputs as well. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, liquid or solid. Solid materials usually have very different key characteristics, and what I want to always try to say to farmers is liquids are fertilizers. They really are fertilizers only, and their key properties just relate to the amount of nutrients that's in them, and also the plant availability or crop availability of those nutrients. Liquids usually have little or no soil conditioning properties as such, and to be honest, they're mainly water largely. But solid materials are both. They've got crop nutrients and they've got organic matter in them. So they're both fertilizers and soil conditioners. Okay. So the first thing is understand what your soils actually need. And this is one of the golden rules I find when farmers are looking to make the best out of their organic materials. Test, test, and test again. So in-depth testing it may well show that your soils are in very good health and they need only very small regular additions of organic matter in addition to fertilizer nutrients which the crop will remove. But the sad fact is, and this is a soil on the east coast of Scotland in the picture there, a soil that's been in long-term arable cultivation. Many soils are in poor condition, many arable soils particularly, and they could benefit from significant additions of organic matter as well as fertilizer nutrients, which we all understand that the crops need. In many cases, the soils have become depleted in organic matter, and when organic matter levels really begin to drop, we start to see sometimes quite a sudden decline in crop yields. Quite often it becomes obvious for the first time after a particularly bad season. So to know where you are, regular soil testing, not only just for the pH and major nutrients and perhaps occasionally trace elements, but also looking at evaluating your soil structure and looking at organic matter content as well. That should be part of a strategy for making best use of bulky organic amendments on your own farm. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to start looking. At the various options. So consider carefully the properties, advantages, and disadvantages of all the bulky organic materials available to you. And of course, that's going to be different for every farm. Some farmers, a very few farmers, are quite lucky because they've either got their own livestock manures or perhaps they can exchange straw for muck available locally or for farmyard manure available locally. Some of them also have access to, say, composts or some organic wastes, but many arable farmers live in areas where there's actually very little available to them. But it's worth making a list, thinking widely, what have you got, what could you get, and consider the costs of buying them, of hauling them, and storage and spreading as well. As Mark was saying earlier, when you simply look at the cost of purchase, haulage, storage and spreading, and then look at that in comparison to the value of nutrients in the materials, it very, very rarely adds up, unless you've got plenty of your own manures and you're not doing much haulage and storage and haulage. You have to look much more deeply at the benefits which you're likely to get, and this is all part of the the evaluation process. And some of these benefits might not be immediately obvious. Okay, next slide, please. So we'll have a look at the main farm-derived bulky organics. Next slide, please. Starting with the obvious one that perhaps most farmers know most about. Sadly, frequently not available to many arable farms in the middle of large, extensively arable areas. Not so much of a problem in Scotland, but down the east side it is, and certainly down into the east side of England, many fields have no fences, let alone any livestock. So there's been livestock absent for a long time. But if you have got access, many advantages. You can, if you've got your own animal manures, you can store them and spread them as it suits. They will certainly contain useful organic matter, cost-effective fertiliser nutrients if you've got your own manures. Few disadvantages really, providing you're making best use of those manures. You do have to make sure that they're stored for at least a year if they're from animals grazed on grass treated with persistent herbicides and you're planning to use them on arable crops. I put a note at the bottom there, and Mark mentioned, I think, something to do with this as well. Consider the costs and benefits of using them across your whole farm. I see many examples where the fields around the steading have had too much manures applied over the years, and they're excessively high in P and perhaps even K, whereas the fields distant from the steading, even some of the better fields, are in poorer health than they could be. So it might make more sense to spread them more thinly, or perhaps start spreading the manures more widely around the farm. Okay, liquid animal manures. Advantages, they're kind of the rocket fuel of the animal manure world, really. They contain a high proportion of readily available nutrients, particularly nitrogen. The slurries, usually they're used on the farm that they're produced or very locally, but they can be a very cost-effective source of nutrients. The disadvantages, again, it's the sort of converse of the fact that the nutrients are so available and they can be so readily available to crops. They're also very easily lost, particularly if the material is applied in an inappropriate way or at inappropriate times of year. The other downside with these materials, they're usually mainly water. So they're heavy in relation to their fertiliser value, and it never makes sense to transport those materials far, particularly the farmers having to pay for them, for that transport. I've also put there, it's also often worth considering some slurry additives in order to limit nitrogen losses. That can work very well. Okay, next slide, please. Poultry manures, I put that in separately because they really are completely different to any other solid or sometimes semi-solid, but usually solid animal manures. Very rich in crop nutrients, particularly NP and K. High proportion of these are readily available. Usually they don't travel all that far, but they are often used often bought and sold between farms, because intensive poultry farms obviously don't always have land. But the one kind of disadvantage with them, they really are fertilizers, because they're usually applied at rates which are too low to provide useful quantities of organic matter. So they're not, that you shouldn't really regard them as soil conditioners. Okay, I want to say a bit more now about crops and green manure residues. So next slide, please. There's an increasing interest in this, and there was quite a lot of stuff which is relevant to this, which both Anne and Mark covered. Perhaps the top of the list there is right, the variability. I certainly have a lot of clients in Scotland here, and know of others in England who are very interested in kind of measuring the impact which their crop residues and also green manure residues can have on soil health and soil quality. Variability is the key, because not only does it depend on the species, it also depends on what species and species mix, whether it's a cover crop or your own residues. It depends on just the tonnage of stuff that's actually there. So the nutrient content varies depending on species, but also the amount of nutrients and organic matter that you're putting back on depends on how well those crops establish and how well they yield. So in other words, what is the application rate? You can end up recycling significant quantities of fertiliser nutrients, and some of these green manure mixtures particularly, you can end up putting significant amounts of carbon back to the soil. But the great difficulty really is in being able to quantify. I think Anne touched on this, being able to quantify exactly what you're doing. Not only is the difficulty how much are you putting on, it's how long does it last. So what type of organic matter are you putting on? If you're putting on lots of fleshy green leaves and then doing lots of cultivations in warm, light soils in the following season, very little of that carbon will last. Whereas if you're creating quite woody organic matter, sort of woody stems, and you're in a reduced tillage system of some sort, especially if you're applying cover crops regularly, you can make significant contributions over perhaps a longer period. And this is one of the things which I think we're going to have to think of more and more. And the other two speakers touched on this. We need to stop thinking just about how much can we do in 1 year, but how much can we do over 10 years if we're doing a little of something good every single year. And it's very difficult to be able to talk about that because research contracts so often last for a year or 2 years or 3 years. And we need to now be looking at measuring perhaps very small contributions to soil health from using organic amendments and cover crops over a much longer period of time. So this is part of the disadvantages of these. Financial and soil health benefits can be hard to quantify. I believe very strongly that they're there if we're using the right methods, but we need to be perhaps looking at the ability to quantify small changes every year over many years rather than huge changes in 1 year. And we need further research data to help increase our knowledge on this. Okay, next slide. Wood chip based compost. This is another one. I've got several clients at the moment that are looking at this. Some farmers, mainly East Coast arable farmers who've little or no access to their own bulky organic materials, they're making their own. And when I first heard this, I thought, goodness me, they're bonkers, because this is going to be hard work. It's going to be very hard to quantify the benefits of doing quite an expensive thing. Okay, next slide, please. What they're actually doing is, in many cases, making their own wood chips from agroforestry on their own land or locally, and mixing that with small quantities of poultry manure or small quantities of green material, and making proper composts in some cases, or adding small amounts of wood chip directly to land. So the advantages are wood contains a lot of lignin, it contains useful quantities of organic matter and quite long-lasting organic matter, contains useful amounts of crop nutrients too. Wood-derived organic matter is known to last well in soils, and the soil health benefits can be significant. But goodness me, these are expensive to produce, and it's not a case of bunging the stuff in a heap and forgetting about it for 6 months. You do need to put some effort in, and there's skill needed to do the job well. They can have high carbon to nitrogen ratios, which can lock up nitrogen in soil. So you need to watch what you're doing. And the financial and soil benefits, I'm getting the impression that it's going to be a little and often over a very long period. So it's going to be hard to quantify. There's quite a few farmers interested in this, though. We need more work, basically, on this. Okay, next slide, please. A bit about off-farm imported bulky organics. There's quite a few of these. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Biosolids, the first I'll mention, that's treated sewage sludge, really. And the water industry calls them biosolids, particularly when they're applied under the Biosolids Assurance Scheme. They're useful in the right situation. They do contain useful organic matter and cost-effective fertilizer nutrients, especially phosphate, but also some nitrogen. Not all assurance schemes and not all buyers actually permit their use. And there's some concern over contaminants of emerging concern, particularly microplastics and one or two other things. I don't really believe there's much of an issue over the high concentrations of PTEs within them, potentially toxic elements or heavy metals. These should be well managed, and usually are if they're applied under the Biosolids Assurance Scheme. But the other thing is not all farms can actually use them. They're right for some people in some situations. A bit about imported solid animal manures. Next slide, please. They do contain useful organic matter. The problem really is they're often not available, and the haulage of bringing them from areas where the farms don't need them to you if you do need them can be really quite high. Other problems are rare, providing the manures are used according to best practice, as for farm-based manures. Okay, I want to briefly mention paper crumble. Paper crumble is a great organic amendment if you can get access to it. Can I have the next slide, please? Useful source of organic matter. Be careful in that it can have, these materials can have quite a high neutralizing value or liming value. Now that's fine for many soils, but it's important to quantify it and not apply it if your soil's already at or above your target pH. They often are quite low in price for the benefits gained, but they can have quite a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that requires to be carefully managed, carefully assessed and managed. But the material, these are wastes, so they've got to be applied under an appropriate permit or exemption. And again, it's really important if you're applying any wastes, I'm only going to say this once, any type of waste, make sure you get an up-to-date analysis and know exactly what you're getting, and make sure it does match for your own needs. Okay, next one. Composts. I find that the good composts that are actually worth having, the past 100 composts that are actually worth having, are actually, yes, they're quite expensive and they're not anything like as available as many farmers would like them to be. Certainly around about where I live, most farmers that want past 100 composts can't get access to them at a reasonable price. They are very good at building soil organic matter, and that soil organic matter, organic matter in composts is woody based. It's wood based, it's got lots of lignin, it's long lasting, it's good stuff. Useful nutrients in there too. But you do have to watch that even the past 100 composts can contain physical contaminants, particularly plastic and little bits of metal and glass. And that's just renders this type of material unacceptable to some people. Okay, next slide, please. Fibre digestates, I'm going to speak about them differently from the other type of digestates, the liquid and whole digestates, because they really are very different. Fibre digestates are fantastic soil conditioners, useful amounts of organic matter, useful amounts of crop nutrients as well. Some have a bit of a liming value. A few of them are wastes, but there's some really good material coming out of farms at the moment. But most farms which produce their own in farm-based digesters will certainly want to hang on to it. They won't want to be selling it off the farm because it's good stuff. On the other hand, liquid digestates, next slide please, completely different. A lot of AD plant salesmen were touting the fact that digestates were great for soil health and soil organic matter and great for soil conditioning. No, they're not really. Liquid digestates and whole digestates are mainly water. They're heavy, and they can be a bit of a nuisance actually to many farms that have their own AD plants. They are fantastic fertilizers. They contain high concentrations of readily available nitrogen and some other nutrients, but because they're such good nitrogen fertilizers, you've really got to be very careful. You must store, handle and apply them with great care according to best practice, because the nutrients present are easily lost. Okay, next slide, please. Briefly, a little bit about the other types of wastes. Food and drinks wastes, for example, and abattoir wastes. A lot of different types of material. Some of the solid ones are really good. They can contain useful amounts of organic matter and crop nutrients. They're often very low in price for the benefits gained if you can get them in your area. Again, they're wastes, so they've got to be applied with the appropriate permit and exemption. The lesson here with this stuff is some of them are great, they're worth having, but you've got to get an accurate, up-to-date set of test data. If you don't understand what the test data means, get help with them, that data. Okay, right, the last few points here. This is a golden rule for this whole, next slide please. Golden rule for this whole talk, that's really lovely whole digestate that you see in that particular bucket. Very important to regularly test the bulky organic materials that you want to use, and particularly those that you use often. Don't just guess. And it's really best not to use just book values from, however good they are, from the RB209 and from the SAC technical notes. Only if you test your own materials can you really be sure that you're getting your crop fertilizer applications right. So get a representative sample, and that's key as well. And then test for dry matter content, which helps you understand how best to spread the stuff. Total nutrients. From that, you can work out what your crop available nutrients are going to be based on how you're going to apply the stuff. Readily available nitrogen, so ammonium, nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen, trace elements if you need them. And quite often I would advise testing for the organic matter content and the liming value as well. Okay, to summarise what we've been talking about here, important, very important, test, interpret the results and understand key properties, not only of the organic materials available to you, but also to your soils. If you're looking to improve your soils, which many of you will be, or you probably wouldn't be here, good baseline data is absolutely essential. And by that I mean not just the standard chemistry data, but some baseline data on your soil structure, perhaps your infiltration rates or soil organic matter as well. Your soils, and also good data, test data on the materials you want to use, and understand the difference between the bulky materials that are fertilizers only and those which are really going to be helping you offer a soil conditioning benefit. Consider carefully the financial benefits, the logistical benefits, and the soil health implications of increasing the amount of bulky fertilizers that you use. And let's be prepared to learn quite a lot more. And I'm certainly not speaking about just farmers. I mean researchers and practical developers of techniques as well. And you know that both Anne and Mark have been saying that we need to understand the benefits of little and often much better than we do. Okay, I've put some details in about where to find out a bit more. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. We are really running late now. We're 15 minutes late, but there's just two questions there. We've still got quite a lot of people in 79 delegates. So just two questions. Could combining cover crops and soil amendments have a bigger impact than just using one option?
Yes, I believe so. The one thing that I find is absolutely impossible is to quantify the effects of cover crops on all farms when you're only working on 5 or 6 farms, and similarly quantifying the effects of mixing the two cover crops and soil amendments. It's going to differ depending on different farms and different soil types, and even between different years. I'm sure the other two speakers will say the same things. So I would say read as widely as you can, and then be prepared to start small scale, not replicated trials, but small scale try it out on your own farm to see what works best in your climate and your own farm. And the other thing that I see working extremely well is small nutrient network groups. In other words, groups of farmers working together to brainstorm ideas about what works in their own area. It's working very well in Scotland, certainly.
And the second one, can animal manures be applied fresh if no herbicides are present, or should they be hot composted?
I think it's horses for courses. I think it depends what you're trying to do. I am not ever going to say that all manures should be treated in the same way. There's plenty of benefits to applying manures fresh. If you're to certain crops, I would never apply fresh manures to crops that could potentially be eaten raw because of the human pathogen risk. And I would never apply fresh manures if there's been herbicide on the grass on which the animals have been grazed. Otherwise, if you're applying fresh manures, you'll get more nitrogen out of those fresh manures than if you stack them, store them and turn them. Every time you turn a manure, you're going to be using energy, using fuel, losing carbon dioxide and losing a little bit of nitrogen. So there's pluses and minuses from composting manures.
Thank you, Audrey. We've literally overrun our time. Just to thank all our speakers, thanks Anne and Mark and Audrey, as well as all the people who are doing the background admin. Our apologies for running late, but they had prepared, so we thought they might as well complete their presentations. Again, if you need bases and Rosso points, contact Maya. If you've got any further questions, please contact me at grace.choto@ahdb.org.uk. The recording will be made available in a week's time on our website, where you'll find other webinar recordings. Again, we are running, this is the first of 3 soil webinars. The next one will be on the 4th of November. It's on soil disinfestation, and we're still finalizing on the topics for the 9th of December 2020 webinar. So thank you, good afternoon and goodbye.